welcome back to an on-location episode of Ask the Agronomist. I'm Laura Cunningham here with Phil Long, and our topic today is on soybean disease. And as we've had a really dry summer, this topic really hasn't been of interest to a lot of farmers, but now that we're getting some heavier rains in areas, and combined with that heat, it is starting to pop up in isolated cases. So we thought it'd be a great time to cover some of the basics on the Big Six, and then some things you can take notes on as we close out the last lap of our growing season here. So Phil, let's just start with white mold and go from there.
Sure. Yeah, this time of the year, just jumping into it, it seems like we see the soybeans starting to senesce a little bit, and then we're like, oh, maybe that's natural, maybe it's a disease. And unfortunately, some of these diseases are showing up, even though we wouldn't expect them to, and white mold would be one of those. So just starting out with white mold, I mean, it's a disease that comes in typically around flowering, so that R1, early flowering time frame, that's the one that if you're going after it with a fungicide, you got to get it early, not at the R3, but ahead of that, because that infection happens in the kind of late flowering, when those flowers are just starting to open, and then as they're closing, it's a soil-borne disease, so it's going to always be there. It's one of those you can't get away from. Once you know you have it, you need to make sure you're documenting it, knowing where it's at in the field, how much it's spreading from year to year. Obviously very dependent on weather as far as how much it's expressed, but the symptoms typically include wilting, is what you can see from the road. The plants start to wilt and kind of curl down, maybe looking more like a drought stress. And then as you approach them, you'll start to see, as the disease advances, you'll see that white puffy stuff on the outside of the stem. You can split the stem and see the sclerosis, or the mouse turds, as I call it, on the inside of the stem. Those little dots going up and down the stem on the very inside. So splitting the stem, I will reiterate that a few times, but that's probably key to all these diseases. But even white mold, even if it's obvious on the outside, you can split the stem and very easily see it. So when it comes to managing these, obviously we're past that point. The best thing right now you can do if you're seeing it is make sure you know where it's at, what field it's in, what variety that you have out in that field. Make all those notes so the next year you can be better planned. Obviously, hopefully you're rotating corn and soybeans, but that'll give you an idea when you're 2 years down the road what you need to be planting in that field. So management in the case of white mold is difficult. You can do a fungicide at R1, at early flowering, and try to capture it, but really disease, the resistance from the variety you're planting is probably number one. That's why we stress our ironclad soybeans so much. That's your best bet. Then the other thing that typically most farmers will take into consideration, if you can, is row spacing. In general, it's canopy closure, so the more dense canopy, the more humidity that you're trapping there, that cool, wet temperatures in the canopy around that R1 is what causes it, or what it causes more expression, I should say, of the disease. So, wider row spacings, 30-inch rows instead of 15s, or less population can also help out as well. So if you're planting 180,000 in 15s, you need to either go in wider rows or much less population to get more airflow down in that canopy. So.
And maybe seed treatment, where I said we're on location today. We're doing a dealer training up in northern Minnesota, standing in front of our seed treatment demo here, which can help keep that plant healthy early on in the season,
Exactly.
Which means a healthier plant later on in the season.
And that goes for all of these diseases. Health early on really is the key. And we always talk about varietal resistance and all this stuff, but just like us as humans, the healthier we are, the better able we are all season to, for that plant to resist a disease infection.
Okay. So that was white mold. Let's do sun dust syndrome and brown stem rot then.
Yeah, so I always talk about these two together, and you could even throw SCN in here. I've dug a lot of roots this year and seen a lot of soybean cyst nematode out there as well. Early to mid-August is a great time. You can actually see the females still attached to the roots. If you look really closely, it's tough to see. You got to be careful digging. So SCN, soybean cyst nematode, brown stem rot, and sudden death syndrome, I lump those all together because they're kind of synergistic between the SCN and the BSR and SDS. So looking at the foliar symptoms, a lot of times it can be, this year I've seen it from everything, from very little expression, and you split the stem and there's symptoms in the vascular tissue of the plant. You still see that SDS, which is that outside tissue, not the very center. The very center, the pith, is where you'll see brown stem rot. So if the pith is brown, the very center, that's brown stem rot. Whereas outside of that pith area, basically next to the outside of the stem and towards the center of the stem or the pith, that will be discolored. And especially if you split it towards the root, you want to start, that's going to work up from the roots. Both of those diseases are soil-borne diseases. They infect early on in the roots and come up through the vascular tissue. And as the season progresses and as environmental conditions change, it can be expressed more. So you may see more foliar symptoms, which would be that interveinal chlorosis. It happens pretty quickly, especially right now once we're getting to that R5, R6 time period. But sometimes you don't even see that. Sometimes you can split a stem, you can see some of that discoloration, that browning in the cortex tissue, but you may not see above ground symptoms. So it's probably still robbing some yield, but obviously if you've lost all your leaf material and it's very, you've got a lot of interveinal chlorosis top to bottom in the plant, you have no photosynthetic capability. So, depending when that sets in, it can obviously make the beans smaller, rob some of that yield in terms of seed size and so forth. But it is, both of those diseases infect early on in the roots. So, a lot of the management, just like you said, with seed treatments, goes hand in hand with this, keeping the plant healthy early on. Which also goes into the management side and what farmers can do in terms of tillage. If there's compaction, sudden death syndrome, especially compaction and drainage are key things when it comes to helping manage that disease, or potentially even delayed planting. If if you're right now you're seeing a lot of SDS pressure out there, that could be a field in 2 years that you maybe delay that field in terms of planting it not so early. If you're trying to plant soybeans earlier, that is a management technique you can use there too. So taking that note down and making sure that you're looking at that with the variety that you're planting is important. So just a lot of things with those three, but they all, like I said, go hand in hand. They show similar symptoms and they have similar management techniques.
Okay, another good thing to note as we kind of close out this season, plan for next, think about what could work better in the next season.
Yeah.
Okay. So this last topic, not necessarily a disease, but still something that's good to note at this time of the season, and that's soybean gall midge.
Yeah, soybean gall midge, like you said, it's great. It's not a disease. It is an insect, but unfortunately it's one that, we talked the last couple years, it's still a new pest. And we still don't know a lot about it. There's been a lot more research this year, so I know university-wise there's going to be a lot more information come out after this season. A lot more management techniques that are being tried. And also understanding which varieties may be more resistant. But the thing is, right now, the best thing we can do is know where it's at. I've been in some of these fields, the last couple weeks was probably ideal in terms of seeing the midges in their process. Right now, they're essentially, at least here in Iowa, are essentially one life cycle. So a few weeks ago, they were kind of migrating. They were in the stem and then migrating out onto the soil. So you kind of see them in both areas. But that's the challenge with this pest. So it's a midge, which is a very small fly, and it comes up. It's gonna lay its eggs in the stem, and then you're gonna have these little tiny midges. As they grow, they're gonna be very small, and then they'll get more dark orange or red, whichever way you want to look at it, as they grow bigger. But they're gonna infect an area very near the soil line. So if you're looking for symptoms, right now, obviously they should be showing wilting symptoms, stressed very hard because they eat the inside of the stem. So it's loss of all the vascular tissue and the nutrients and water going through the plant. So these are typically starting from field edges. This is kind of like we talked this year, didn't have a lot of major outbreaks on the spider mites, but it's kind of one of those things. It's going to move from the ditch and from the grassy areas in the field. So the big key here is knowing where it's at and seeing those areas. And I know when I was walking some fields this year, it's farther out than what you think. You can go there, you can start splitting stems. It's pretty easy to even just peel back the outside of the stem, see those things and see them coming out of the stem, and then work your way out into the field and see how far they really are. Not a fun process, obviously, but you need to know where they're at. If it's in an area that's maybe treatable. We don't know that insecticide has a proven effectiveness against it because we just can't catch those things when they're in, outside of the plant, essentially. It's really tough right now. So, maybe in the future it's something that we treat, this time of the year we can get more of them, more of the midges as they're in larval stage, before they go back into the soil and so forth and move. But it's just a really tough pest right now that we don't know a lot about. So the biggest thing with the soybean gall midge is going out. If you know it's in your area, checking those soybean fields and then noting where they're at, because they're likely going to move. If you rotate the next field next door, they're going to move next year into that field. So it'll help to stay ahead of it. And then also noting any varietal resistances. It's something that we're trying to do, as a product team and a team at Latham's, making sure that we're keeping track of which varieties may be more or less resistant to these kind of pests, especially when they're new on the scene, like the gall midge. So.
Okay, well, great tips today, Phil. Things to note as we close out this season, plan for next. Do you have anything else you want to leave with our listeners as we wrap up today?
We talked about a lot of diseases, but obviously we didn't cover them all. I thought we'd see more charcoal rot. I'm sure there's some out there, but we talked about splitting the stem and documenting. I think those are the two biggest things we can do. Once you learn to start splitting the stem, it's easier to understand. You have a better grasp than just looking at the plant and taking a guess at it. So it gets you a little more in tune to what's going on in the field. So do that, take notes. If you're using the Data Forward app or something, you can map those locations very easily and really track where things are at and where things may be moving.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks for tuning in today, everyone. We'll be back next week with another episode.